everyone. My name is Carmen. I'm an IB1 student, and I'm joined by three incredible guests today. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
After you, Reuben.
I'm Reuben. I'm a founder and CEO of a creative platform called Contact. I'm also a designer and creative director. Yeah, that's me.
My name's Arifa, and I used to run an organisation called Educate to Eradicate that I founded back in 2016.
So my name's Harry. I'm also an ex-IB student, so on a similar trajectory, and I co-founded an organisation called Prospect 100, and we're we want to become the TED of design competitions. I guess that's kind of the North Star vision for us. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So my first question for you guys is, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about an issue you were trying to solve and if your youth helps your advocacy or maybe even hinders it.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I really have always been deeply fascinated about how young people are getting into industry because obviously, I don't know, with the world of tech, whenever I spoke to my parents, I'm from rural Bedfordshire where tech's maybe not the most prevalent thing of all time. And I was always deeply fascinated about how you get into industry. And I asked my parents questions and they wouldn't necessarily know. And they'd always give this advice about really traditional career paths, or sort of, law, property, accounting, etc. And the advice they would give would be really traditional in that respect. So I was always fascinated by these young people you see online doing the craziest things and always be asking them questions. And for me, I've always been really fascinated by this idea of how can we help more young people get into the industry of their choice through potentially what would be considered unconventional means by like my parents, but actually are becoming the convention, I suppose. So that's a problem that I've always been fascinated by. And that's why Prospect 100 started, because I saw some designers online that were making their way into industry through really untraditional means. And I thought that instead of creating a podcast or something where you're kind of telling people, I love the idea of creating something which can lead people to action that hopefully, sort of encourages them to be active and get towards that point rather than just saying, here's what you should do and go and do it yourself. So that was like my perspective. I mean, Reuben, you're obviously in the creative industry yourself, right? So I'd be super interested to know how you got there. And
yeah, very similar experience. I've been building businesses since I was like 14. So, whilst I was doing GCSEs, I was, always had my side hustles and, kind of got to a position where, I guess like social media was coming up at the same time. So it's like I had a platform and I could build connections to people in an industry that I was so abstracted away from. So yeah, I'm from West Sussex, from a tiny village of like 2,000 people. So like to kind of be able to get to know people online through social media and then start like making my way into the creative industries when I was around 17. That was really like it was a big struggle I started by interning and assisting and just doing anything really to get the experience. And I guess like something that I'm just like really passionate about now is trying to make that process like easier for young people, because I experienced so many hardships in being young in a big city like London and being a creative and trying to like support myself financially and like navigating that. So trying to make it easier for people to be discovered, get paid fairly for what they do, and hopefully have like an amazing experience doing it. How about you, Arifa?
Well, I'm from a completely different sector, so in the violence against women and girls sector, which is a little bit different. Similar to Reuben, I think I started my journey when I was about 14. And if you're asking whether my age was a help or a hindrance, I definitely think it was a help because it's almost a bit of a red herring. I had done all of this research and understood the concept of honour in a way that most other people wouldn't have, because not only was it a lived experience, it's also something that is so inherently part of the cultures that I come from that it wouldn't make sense to say, well, you're an adult, so you must understand this concept better than a 14-year-old, because it's not about age, it's about your experience. And I've always said that a 15-year-old can experience more in those 15 years of their life than some 50-year-olds will ever experience. So using age as a measure of wisdom, for example, is a false measure, I'd say. It's all about your experience, and your wisdom actually is it comes from the application of your knowledge. So I was able to, within 4 years, apply the knowledge that I had learnt into creating a safeguarding programme, so that at 18, I was going into schools and training teachers, police officers, doctors and midwives. And these teachers would have taught me 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So for them, there was a bit of a, oh, well, who are you? Who do you think you are, coming in and telling us what to do? But at the end of the day, I was an expert in my subject, and they couldn't argue with that. So when you go into a situation and you've built your reputation on the fact that you know what you're talking about, there's very little sort of comeback that can sort of reflect, oh, actually, maybe you don't know what you're doing. So to tie that up, I think, yeah, it's definitely helpful doing things at a young age, because it sets a precedent. It allows people to recognise that your experiences are your own, and there is something to be learnt from everybody, regardless of how much older or younger they might be than you.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. So my next question kind of addresses an intersection between fashion and advertising. So I'm hoping you, Reuben and Harry, you'll have something to add, but of course, you're welcome to chime in. So one problem we face as a generation is fast fashion and mass consumerism. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think the youth, who are kind of the primary consumers of these clothes, responsible for this issue, as opposed to the companies that force feed like advertisements to youth promoting mass consumerism? So where does the blame lie?
I think
Could be a bit of both.
we actually ran a competition with an organization called Kering. So they're the group that own Gucci and Balenciaga, etc. And what was really interesting is, with this competition they did, was they really wanted ideas from young people. I think one of the clearly like tricky things is when you're young, your spending power is not necessarily that high. So for example, a lot of the brands that have great practices are very often quite expensive. And so I think, you know, what I really have loved to see from the young creatives that we interact with all the time is that these young creatives have amazing ideas. And an organization like Kering, who again can afford the biggest names in the fashion industry, etc., really valued the ideas from those young creatives and were wanting to hold a forum in the form of, you know, a Prospect 100 competition to get those ideas from young people. And I think what's great is when we put that call to action out, the thousands of young people that came straight away with their ideas from all different countries from around the world and really different backgrounds between that sort of 16 to 25 age group. So I think what I really like to see from that initiative is that even the biggest sort of the brands where you would expect them to care almost least in some way about the voices, because, you know, they have their own incredible creatives in-house, actually they're wanting to hear the voice of young people. And what's great is that young people are responding. And so for me, I really like to look at the kind of the future, and I guess what's positive to come. And I think that the fact that young people are really actively contributing their ideas to these massive organizations, and that organizations the size of Kering are listening, for me, that really gives me a lot of hope and positivity, I suppose, which I guess the festival is all about. So yeah, that's the takeaway from my experience. But Reuben, you've got a way deeper experience than me in fashion, so yeah.
Yeah, I think the responsibility is on both sides. It's the consumer as well as the retailers and the brands. I think that it's you know, there's a lot of power in numbers, right? So if the consumer can, if people band together, then you can start to, you know, shift and make change. So I think that you know, having people make conscious decisions around, you know, what they want to consume, and you know, what is like ethical, is really important. But there needs to be transparency from the brands for people to understand what they're buying into. And I think that's probably the challenge with advertising, in that you know, at the end of the day, like, you know, these brands are just trying to sell their products, and they'll do whatever they can to have somebody to buy into it. And it's like, how do you get them to really care about, you know, the planet and all of these other societal issues. And I think that does come from like the consumers like demanding change.
So, Arifa, your work with Educate to Eradicate, a lot of the problems you address, are deeply rooted in cultural traditions. So I was kind of wondering, how do you approach reforming these issues without attacking said culture, and if perhaps youth can play a role in being the key to this change?
Okay, so I would say that in terms of attacking cultures, honour abuse is really important to be framed as a form of abuse, because culture is a typical food, for example, or a traditional dress, or something that is celebrated and traditional, and something that you really want to hold dear to you. What we've got to be absolutely clear about is forcing a child or even an adult into marriage, or committing female genital mutilation against a child is a form of abuse, full stop, right? And so you've got to unpick these issues and say, right, well, if you're taking somebody abroad for the purposes of forcing them to marry, that's kidnap. Once they are forcibly married, any sexual activity within that relationship is marital rape, because if you haven't consented to the relationship, you're unlikely to consent to anything else within that relationship. So when you begin to break down the larger term, you realise actually how cruel these practices are. So it becomes very easy to say, this is wrong and this must stop. And it's also really important to remember that this is not a specific culture that it comes from. So honour abuse is prevalent globally, and I would always recommend that people look into 2 case studies, which is not typical that people would understand of honour abuse, and that's Ireland and Mexico. So in Mexico, which is a Roman Catholic country, something like 65% of girls under the age of 18 are at risk of child marriage, and it's to do with poverty, it's to do with sort of connections and promises that are made that you wouldn't necessarily think are part of the Mexican culture, but they are. And then in Ireland, it wasn't that long ago that if a girl got pregnant out of wedlock and had a child, she might be sent to a laundry or a Magdalene institution, and her child would be taken away from her. So even that is a form of honour abuse that you might not necessarily understand, but falls under that same bracket. So this isn't about attacking the Irish culture or the Pakistani culture or the Mexican culture at all. This is about saying that across the board, every time this happens, it's wrong, and we need to be able to spot the signs of these abuses and find ways to prevent and protect these young people. So I don't find it challenging I don't see it as attacking cultures, because there's a very firm red line drawn there, and we mustn't cross it.
Yeah. All right. So my last question is, it's hard enough being a young adult, let alone entrepreneurs and change makers and doing the things you're doing. So has there been a moment where you've doubted yourself, and how did you work out of that mindset?
Plenty.
Off to you then.
No, please.
I guess my initial thought is this idea that every day almost you have an up and then a down and an up and a down. And in your head, everything feels so big, right? And when in reality, those bumps are probably actually like +1 rather than +10, and the dips are actually probably only -1 versus -10. I think you really need to tell yourself kind of, I don't know, when there's a high to kind of, okay, like, it's not a 10, like really, I really like this idea of not getting too up and not getting too down. That's quite a tricky thing, but you really need to, in some ways, teach your mind. I just say, like, any young person that's starting something, like, I really struggled at the beginning with using the term business. Like, for me, that was almost like too close to a 10. So I would use the word project, because that really kept it grounded and made it feel a bit more like, oh, it's just another school project, or it's another something. And so I always tried to do things, for me, linguistic determinism, I guess, like really just using language, which always helps me stay at +1 rather than +5 or 6 or 7, and trying to, reassure yourself when your mind's on. But obviously that can be really tricky sometimes. And so, yeah, I think it's all about working out what works for you. But for me, it's really, how can I keep it within that kind of gap? And for me, language in my head is everything. I'm a very mental person. So yeah, that for me is the big thing. But yeah, I guess what would be your number one piece of advice?
Growth mindset, for sure. You guys have probably heard about it. Carol Dweck, professor at Stanford University, and it's this idea that if you haven't achieved it, you haven't achieved it yet. And so every time I fell short of something that I wanted to achieve, or actually every time I made a mistake, I had to constantly reinforce to myself, mistakes are good because they help me learn. They show me how much further I have to go. So it's actually the same technique that I used to pass maths eventually, because I was terrible at maths at school. And then as soon as I realised that I was encountering problems with, for example, the paperwork with registering, educate to eradicate, all these little things that cropped up along the way, I had to remind myself at every point, no, if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. You can use that as the launch pad to build better and stronger. So don't let it get you down. And second to that, I would say having an incredibly supportive network of family, of friends, people that will actually come over and give you a cuddle and say, look, it's okay. You're doing fantastic work. You've got what it takes to keep going. Because as young people, we end up sort of tunnel vision. And then in our own mind, we are our own worst critic and enemy sometimes. We tell ourselves sort of that negative reinforcement, and that's really dangerous. So if you've got people around you that can kind of spot that and say, no, you're doing okay, get back on the horse and keep going, that's always helpful. So growth mindset, and also having a nurturing community of people around you together.
Yeah, I think, similar. Trusting yourself to learn. So like similar to like a growth mindset, but just knowing that in any situation you'll be able to learn and figure out, what the next step is, even though it might not be obvious in that moment. And I think one thing that helps me a lot is, especially at times where I'm doubting myself, is just reconnecting to why I'm doing it in the very beginning. So just understanding what your mission is as an individual. Which obviously can take time to find and figure out, but once you kind of know what your personal values are and why you're doing what you're doing, then it's not really about your own ego and your personal success and whether you think that you're succeeding or not succeeding. It's more about the impact that you're making or you're going to make in the future. So I like to think, it might be quite strange, but I like to think in like a 50-year time frame. So it's like, what can I accomplish within 50 years, versus by the time I'm 25 or by the time I'm 30, I want to have done all of these things. It's kind of, looking back on my life, 50 years into the future when I'm a lot older.
Anything in particular you're hoping for in 50 years?
So for me, it's about creating a future where people are free to self-express. And I think that kind of relates to many different, problems or things that we see and people whether that's marginalization or different things like that, where I think that just having a society where people are able to be themselves, express what they want to express, and kind of everyone get along harmoniously, that's my vision, and I'm trying to do a small part to have an impact on that.
Quickly building off the 50-year point, I think that's one really important thing for any young person that's starting something new is, as you mentioned, Reuben, a lot of people think about the really short-term goals, but what's been mentioned here today is that you started your first project, was it 14 or 15, you said, and you were the same. And so what's interesting is those projects you started when you were 14 or 15 probably aren't exactly what you're working on today, or in some cases, maybe it's completely different, but it's those skills that you learn when you're 14 or 15 by starting something new, and you learn for the next time. So I think for any young person that wants to start their own project, whether that be making an album of music, starting a business or starting a charity, it's not about, more than anything, it's about learning, I think, for your own personal. So even if that specific project doesn't get you to where you hope it to be in the time you hope it does, what you'll find is the next project you start, the skills that you learn from that give you a head start. And instead of starting at level 1, you're starting at level 3 or 4. And I think that's a really important thing to note, that everything you do is really part of the learning, and it's part of that 50-year plan almost
Yeah.
that you're setting out. I suppose.
And like the projects can change. Like you don't have to lock yourself into one thing. Like I do many different things, and that's always a challenge. Like what should I focus on? But the mission kind of stays the same.